Started at Longyou. All right, so I wanted to say that, of course, we have next week off for Thanksgiving, and I will have an extra optional class session held on Friday the 5th of Critique Week, if you guys would like. We'll discuss some selections from Adorno's aesthetic theory before we come back in the final week and read some other Adorno and also get back to some of the October writers. So same time, same place. Like I said, optional. This is a grad survey class, so I don't know whether you guys will be done with Critique Week or just burnt out or just like wiped out. But anyway, yeah. So, nobody posted anything. I guess I didn't get any volunteers for the readings this week. I guess I did not. I suppose I did not.
The paper is due on the 21st.
Yeah. So it will be right. It will be the Sunday after our last class session, but a little bit of extra time because our class is Friday. All right, so I wanted to start off just mentioning again that we have several kind of set-piece classic debates in the course. Earlier in the course, we started with Habermas and Lyotard on postmodernism. We then looked at T.J. Clark and Michael Fried on modernism and on Clement Greenberg's legacy with respect to modernism in particular. Now we have Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault on authorship, on the question of authorship. This is another classic debate where Roland Barthes wrote an essay and Michel Foucault wrote a critical response to it. Then we will look at The End of Painting by Douglas Crimp and Rosalind Krauss's Originality of the Avant-Garde, a Postmodern Repetition, in which they are trying to approach visual art from the standpoint of Barthes and Foucault, the issues raised about authorship, how we understand art within, again, a cultural context. The Rosalind Krauss that we read previously at the Sculpture in the Expanded Field, she was trying to open up the cultural axes along which the art form of sculpture had been defined. And we discussed a little bit how she's trying to bring a structuralist approach to thinking about art history. Now we're dealing with structuralism, post-structuralism, semiotics. We're dealing with a lot of different issues with Barthes and Foucault. All right, so you'll notice just in the titles of the two pieces that we looked at this week, the death of the author versus what is an author. So the death of the author has more of a polemical and kind of manifesto quality to it, and certainly Roland Barthes is advocating not only a critical approach, but maybe even a practical approach to writing. And Foucault pouring a little bit of cold water on that, trying to temper that a bit with the more basic question, well, what do we even mean by authorship? What is an author? And putting it very deliberately in a more academic tone than Roland Barthes. So let's see how Barthes starts off. In his story Sarracine, Balzac, describing a castrato disguised as a woman, writes the following sentence. This was woman herself, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive worries, her impetuous boldness, her fussings, and her delicious sensibility. Who is speaking thus? Is it the hero of the story, bent on remaining ignorant of the castrato hidden beneath the woman? Is it Balzac, the individual, furnished by his personal experience with a philosophy of woman? Is it Balzac, the author, professing literary ideas on femininity? Is it universal wisdom? Romantic psychology? We shall never know. Pardon me. For the good reason that writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body writing. No doubt it has always been this way. As soon as a fact is narrated, no longer with a view to acting directly on reality, but intransitively, that is to say, finally outside of any function other than that of the very practice of the symbol itself, this disconnection occurs. The voice loses its origin. The author enters into his own death. Writing begins. The sense of this phenomenon, however, has varied. In ethnographic societies, the responsibility for a narrative is never assumed by a person, but by a mediator, a shaman or relator whose performance, the mastery of the narrative code, may possibly be admired, but never his genius. The author is a modern figure, a product of our society, insofar as, emerging from the Middle Ages with English empiricism, French rationalism, and the personal faith of the Reformation, it discovered the prestige of the individual, of, as it is more nobly put, the human person. It is thus logical that in literature it should be this positivism, the epitome and culmination of capitalist ideology, which has attached the greatest importance to the person of the author. The author still reigns in histories of literature, biographies of writers, interviews, magazines, and in the very consciousness of men of letters, anxious to unite their person and their work through diaries and memoirs. The image of literature to be found in ordinary culture is tyrannically centered on the author, his person, his life, his tastes, his passions, while criticism still consists for the most part in saying that Baudelaire's work is the failure of Baudelaire the man, Van Gogh his madness, Tchaikovsky's his vice. The explanation of a work is always sought in the man or woman who produced it, as if it were always in the end, through the more or less transparent allegory of the fiction, the voice of a single person, the author, confiding in us. Though the sway of the author remains powerful, the new criticism has often done no more than consolidate it. It goes without saying that certain writers have long since attempted to loosen it. In France, Mallarmé was doubtless the first to see and to foresee in its full extent the necessity to substitute language itself for the person who until then had been supposed to be its owner. For us too, it is language which speaks, not the author. To write is, through a prerequisite impersonality, not at all to be confused with the castrating objectivity of the realist novelist, to reach that point where only language acts, performs, and not me. Mallarmé's entire poetics consists in suppressing the author in the interest of writing, which is, as will be seen, to restore the place of the reader. Valéry, encumbered by a psychology of the ego, considerably diluted Mallarmé's theory, but his taste for classicism, leading him to turn to the lessons of rhetoric, he never stopped calling into question and deriding the author. He stressed the linguistic and, as it were, hazardous nature of his activity, and throughout his prose works he militated in favor of the essentially verbal condition of literature, in the face of which all recourse to the writer's interiority seemed to him pure superstition. Now you guys will recall that we read earlier in the semester we read Marcuse, the note on dialectic when we were introducing the question of Marxism. And I'll make reference to that now, that Marcuse quoted from Mallarmé and Valery. Right. So this is to help for Marcuse to illustrate the dialectic, what's meant by the dialectic, and what's meant by the dialectical negation. Right, so dialectic and poetic language meet rather on common ground. The common element is the search for an authentic language, the language of negation, as the great refusal to accept the rules of a game in which the dice are loaded. And I mentioned that Mallarmé has a famous poem called The Roll of the Dice. The absent must be made present, because the greatest part of the truth is in that which is absent. So also from the first week of the course, Robert Pippin had to say what's not without saying nothing. Right. Like, so what is missing in our form of life, what is absent, and what is its claim on our attention? This is Mallarmé's classic statement. I say a flower, and out of the oblivion where my voice vanishes all contours, musically rises different from every known blossom, the one absent from all bouquets, idea itself indelicate. And he continues, in the authentic language, the word is not the expression of a thing, but rather the absence of the thing. The word makes the things disappear and imposes upon us the feeling of a universal want and even of its own want. Poetry is thus the power to deny the things, the power which Hegel claims paradoxically for all thought. Valery asserts, in short, thought is the labor which brings to life in us that which does not exist. He asks the rhetorical question, what would we be without the help of that which does not exist? All right, so I recall this only because, in some ways, Roland Barthes is doing the exact opposite of Marcuse. So with Marcuse citing Mallarmé and Valery, the word makes the thing disappear. Right, language makes the thing disappear, whereas here, language makes the author disappear. Right, so rather than language serving to deny the things or to negate that which exists, instead, it's turning on the subject. Now, he mentions the new criticism. So new criticism, this is middle of the 20th century, so before the time that Roland Barthes is writing. So new criticism is to just look at the writing and ignore the biography of the author and the historical context. Like just look at the literary work itself. So that's the new criticism. So looking at the work rather than at the author. And Barthes is sharing that moment, but also departing from it and taking issue with it. So he says that, again, paradoxically, that what new criticism is doing is actually more firmly establishing the role of the author, but by another means, right? Not by means of biography or history, but by means of authorship, meaning what's the status of the literary work? What's the status of the text? And by the way, those aren't equivalent concepts. We'll see that Barthes substitutes the writer for the author, and he substitutes the text for the work. So if you ever wanted to know where this rhetoric or jargon that we have of talking about texts, this is where it comes from. Right, so rather than talking about a literary work or a novel or a poem or an essay or a book, it's a text. Everything's a text. Again, we're going to see what Douglas Crimp and Rosalind Krauss do with this idea. Dissolving works into text. So author replaced by writer, work replaced by text. So why does Barthes make this move? Either of those moves, either to replace the author with the writer or the work with the text. Is to bring about the death of the author, but also the birth of the reader. Right, so out of the death of the author is supposed to come the reader. Now, I also want to remind us of Walter Benjamin, of the author as producer, because there are some affinities and overlaps between Roland Barthes and Walter Benjamin. We read Benjamin's author as producer also earlier in the semester. And Benjamin talked about also wanting to problematize the category of the work. He echoes that in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And he advocated for writers to seek through their work, through their production, to create, to teach, to inspire, and to allow for other writers. Right? So the writer who doesn't teach other writers teaches no one. We could also say that about art more generally. The artist who doesn't teach other artists teaches no one. And he brought up some examples from Soviet practice of the falling away of the distinction in the newspaper between letters to the editor and authored articles. So it allows the readers to become the writers, and for the reader and the writer to exist on more equal footing. But again, there is a role for the writer. We could even say for the author, certainly for the artist. But again, the author as producer. So Barthes is trying to do something similar, but we'll see how he does it. This category of the text is important because it means that reading and writing fit into language in a particular way. And so how language functions. Right, so what he said in the passage I just read, it is language which speaks, not the author. It is language which speaks, not the author. Right, this is why he says that as soon as writing begins, the author dies. It's kind of a little melodramatic, but it really has to do with this separation that he's trying to effect between the author and the writing. So he brings up Proust, and I'll just mention that Lyotard in the debate between Habermas and Lyotard that we read. Lyotard talked about the two souls of modernism, Joyce and Proust. Right, so there's the sort of forward-looking and the backward-looking. There's a kind of more romantic, more nostalgic, more melancholic version of modernism, and that's Proust. But let's see how Proust functions here with Barthes. Proust himself, despite the apparently psychological character of what are called his analyses, was visibly concerned with the task of inexorably blurring, by an extreme subtilization, the relation between the writer and his characters, by making of the narrator not he who has seen and felt, nor even he who is writing, but he who is going to write. The young man in the novel, but in fact, how old is he, and who is he, wants to write but cannot. The novel ends when writing at last becomes possible. Proust gave modern writing its epic. By a radical reversal, instead of putting his life into the novel, as is so often maintained, he made of his very life a work for which his own book was the model. So that it is clear to us that Charles does not imitate Montesquieu, but that Montesquieu, in his anecdotal historical reality, is no more than a secondary fragment derived from Charles. Lastly, to go no further than this prehistory of modernity, surrealism, though unable to accord language a supreme place, language being system and the aim of the movement being romantically a direct subversion of codes, itself moreover illusory, a code cannot be destroyed, only played off, contributed to the desacralization of the image of the author by ceaselessly recommending the abrupt disappointment of expectations of meaning, the famous surrealist jolt, by entrusting the hand with the task of writing as quickly as possible what the head itself is unaware of, that is automatic writing, by accepting the principle and the experience of several people writing together. Leaving aside literature itself, such distinctions really become invalid. Linguistics has recently provided the destruction of the author with a valuable analytic tool by showing that the whole of the enunciation is an empty functioning perfectly without there being any need for it to be filled with the person of the interlocutors. Linguistically, the author is never more than the instance of writing, just as I is nothing other than the instance of saying I. Language knows a subject, not a person, and the subject, empty outside of the very enunciation which defines it, suffices to make language hold together, suffices, that is to say, to exhaust it. Okay, so he brings in surrealism. Again, I'll recall the Habermas versus Lyotard, that Habermas turned a rather jaundiced eye, looked critically at what he called the periodic Baudelarian surrealist revolts in the realm of art and culture, which he said the young conservatives or the postmodernists were taking as their exemplar, as indeed as their model, but that left other domains untouched, meaning it allowed for the continuation of capitalism and all sorts of things in the realm of the economy, society, and politics. Right, so in other words, what Lyotard called language games. So the 20th century avant-garde is the background, is the essential background for postmodernism, very self-consciously, whether in the form of Roland Barthes or in the form of Rosalind Krauss and Douglas Crimp. Right, so the idea is that postmodernism isn't just happening in the 60s, but rather is a new way of understanding what they thought had already been going on for quite some time. And indeed might go all the way back to Baudelaire. So it really touches on the entire realm of cultural production and art and literature in the capitalist era from the middle of the 19th century. Right? So it's a dispute over what the significance of this is. Was the significance of modernism. So postmodernism is really not supposed to be separate from modernism, but a dispute on how we understand the meaning of modernism. Also, you'll recall that Habermas said that it was characteristic for the young conservatives to blur the distinction between art and science. So Lyotard did that, and now Barthes is doing that as well by saying linguistics, which is a scientific discipline, not a literary interpretive exercise. Linguistics is going to tell us how language works, and therefore how writing works, and therefore how literature works. Now, I will also say that surrealism, the surrealist movement, actually thought that there was nothing more surreal than science. All right, so remember, surrealism is not meant to be other than reality. It's meant to be hyper-reality or kind of uber-reality. It's supposed to be heightened reality, which is why they could take science as some kind of a model for their own practice. How so? Well, of course, it aestheticizes science. It aestheticizes science. What Barthes is saying here about what linguistics shows about how language functions, he's looking at it not merely functionally, but also aesthetically. Right? We're supposed to feel something reading Barthes. We're definitely supposed to be affected by the way he is describing things. Right. He uses, again, dramatic language, right? That language functions to hold together, but that means to exhaust it. So there's the question of meaning. The removal of the author, one could talk here with Brecht of a veritable distancing. So the distanciation effect or alienation effect or estrangement effect, that's what he's referencing here. The author diminishing like a figurine at the far end of the literary stage is not merely a historical fact or an act of writing. It utterly transforms the modern text. Or, which is the same thing, the text is henceforth made and read in such a way that at all its levels the author is absent. The temporality is different. The author, when believed in, is always conceived of as the past of his own book. Book and author stand automatically on a single line, divided into a before and an after. The author is thought to nourish the book, which is to say that he exists before it, thinks, suffers, lives for it, is in the same relation of antecedence to his work as a father to his child. In complete contrast, the modern scripter, and this is his word for writer, or it's écriture, is born simultaneously with the text, is in no way equipped with a being preceding or exceeding the writing, is not the subject with the book as predicate. There was no other time than that of the Annunciation, and every text is eternally written here and now. So what does he mean by that? Well, of course he means the text exists only when it's read. And so whatever we mean by the author comes into existence in reading. The fact is, or it follows that, writing can no longer designate an operation of recording, notation, representation, depiction, as the classics would say, but rather it designates exactly what linguists, referring to Oxford philosophy, call a performative, a rare verbal form, exclusively given in the first person and in the present tense, in which the enunciation has no other content, contains no other proposition, than the act by which it is uttered. Something like the I declare of kings or the I sing of very ancient poets. Having buried the author, the modern scripter can no longer believe, as according to the pathetic view of his predecessors, that this hand is too slow for his thought or passion, and that consequently, making a law of necessity, he must emphasize this delay and indefinitely polish his form. For him, on the contrary, the hand, cut off from any voice, born of a pure gesture of inscription and not of expression, traces a field without origin, or which at least has no other origin than language itself, language which ceaselessly calls into question all origins. We know now that a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, but a multidimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. The text is a tissue of quotations drawn from the innumerable centers of culture. Similar to Bouvard and Pécuchet, those eternal copyists, at once sublime and comic, and whose profound ridiculousness indicates precisely the truth of writing, the writing can only imitate a gesture that is always anterior and never original. His only power is to mix writings, to counter the ones with the others in such a way as never to rest on any of them. Did he wish to express himself? He ought at least to know that the inner thing he thinks to translate is itself only a ready-formed dictionary, its words only explainable through other words, and so on indefinitely. Something experienced in exemplary fashion by the young Thomas de Quincey, he who was so good at Greek that in order to translate absolutely modern ideas and images into that dead language, he had, so Baudelaire tells us, in Artificial Paradise, created for himself an unfailing dictionary vastly more extensive and complex than those resulting from the ordinary patience of purely literary themes. Succeeding the author, the scripter no longer bears within him passions, humors, feelings, impressions, but rather this immense dictionary from which he draws a writing that can know no halt. Life never does more than imitate the book, and the book itself is only a tissue of signs, an imitation that is lost, infinitely deferred. Okay. So, where is he going with this? It's putting it in the hands of the reader, which means that there's no authoritative interpretation. Now, I will also say that he has a dual movement here. So if you recall from the first week of the course, Susan Buck-Morss pointed out that the work of the artist, in this case that of the writer, is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. And the role of the critic is to recognize it. Let's see what Barthes has to say about the critic. Once the author is removed, the claim to decipher a text becomes quite futile. To give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing. Such a conception suits criticism very well, the latter then allotting itself the important task of discovering the author, or the author's hypostases, society, history, psyche, liberty, beneath the work. When the author has been found, the text is explained. Victory to the critic. Hence, there is no surprise in the fact that historically the reign of the author has also been that of the critic. Nor again in the fact that criticism, be it new, the new criticism we were talking about, is today undermined along with the author. In the multiplicity of writing, everything is to be disentangled, nothing deciphered. The structure can be followed, run like the thread of a stocking at every point and at every level, but there is nothing beneath. The space of writing is to be ranged over, not pierced. Writing ceaselessly posits meaning, ceaselessly to evaporate it, carrying out a systematic exemption of meaning. In precisely this way, literature, it would be better from now on to say writing, by refusing to assign a secret and ultimate meaning to the text and to the world as text, liberates what may be called an anti-theological activity, an activity that is truly revolutionary, since to refuse to fix meaning is, in the end, to refuse God and his hypostases, reason, science, and law. Now, this is not something that we've talked about in this course specifically, but when he talks about the theology and the author God and this kind of thing, of course we have to think about where does language originate and where does writing originate. So language originates in religion, just as art in general originates from religion. It's meant to enunciate religious lessons, theological truths. That's what it's invented to do. And then with the Neolithic Revolution, with the agricultural revolution, with settled traditional civilizations, something new is invented, and that's writing. And once the Word of God is written down, it goes from being something that everyone understands to something that no one understands. And that's why you need a special caste of people to tell you what it means, and that's the priestly caste. So all writing, so art, the art of writing, literature, it all comes ultimately from scripture. It all comes from the sacred texts. And the sacred texts are the Word of God, even if mediated. I think I told you guys did I tell you guys my husband is, my partner is Muslim. So the big debate between Islam and Christianity and Judaism, if you want to know what the big debate is, it's that only the Quran can be counted as the actual word of God. Otherwise, the Talmud, the Bible, the Gospels have been altered by people. They've been corrupted by people. They're not the true word of God. And then the question is, okay, so how did the Quran come into existence as the true word of God? Well, of course, it's mediated. It's mediated by two things. One is the Archangel Gabriel, who told Muhammad, but then Muhammad himself, who told other people who wrote it down. Because I think Muhammad himself was illiterate. Right. But nonetheless, it's still the Word of God. And that's where it all comes from. Right. That's where the tradition of literary criticism, literary interpretation, literary exegesis, finding meaning, the first form of that is scriptural exegesis, scriptural interpretation. Because alongside the holy books that are the Word of God, there's a whole literature interpreting it. So with the Quran, there's the Hadith, there's a whole tradition of textual exegesis that produces more writing. So this is part of where Barthes is coming from. I thought that I would just sort of remind us of what the stakes are that he's invoking here. So the critic is in the same position to the work of literature as the priest is with respect to scripture. Right? The authority of the scripture is also the authority of the priestly caste. And in this way, the authority of the literature is the authority of the critic. And he wants not only the death of the author, but the death of the critic too. Okay, so at the very end of the piece, what happened? Let me jump ahead here. Let's come back to the Balzac sentence. No one, no person says it. Its source, its voice is not the true place of the writing, which is reading. Another very precise example will help to make this clear. Recent research, Vernant, has demonstrated the constitutively ambiguous nature of Greek tragedy, its texts being woven from words with double meanings that each character understands unilaterally. This perpetual misunderstanding is exactly the tragic. There is, however, someone who understands each word in its duplicity and who, in addition, hears the very deafness of the characters speaking in front of him. This someone being precisely the reader, or here the listener. Thus is revealed the total existence of writing. A text is made of multiple writings, drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation. But there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader, not, as was hitherto said, the author. The reader is the space on which all the quotations that make up a writing are inscribed without any of them being lost. A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. Yet this destination cannot any longer be personal. The reader is without history, biography, psychology. He is simply that someone who holds together in a single field all the traces by which the written text is constituted. Which is why it is derisory to condemn the new writing in the name of a humanism hypocritically turned champion of the reader's rights. Classic criticism has never paid any attention to the reader. For it, the writer is the only person in literature. We are now beginning to let ourselves be fooled no longer by the arrogant, anti-phrastical recriminations of good society in favor of the very thing it sets aside, ignores, smothers, or destroys. We know that to give writing its future, it is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. Okay, so what is he talking about? The new writing. So he's writing in the era of, if you guys have ever heard of this, the Nouveau Roman, the new novel. There's Alain Robbe-Grillet. He's a major writer of the Nouveau Roman. There's also film. There's French New Wave film that's based on the Nouveau Roman. So have you heard of the film Last Year at Marienbad? Have you ever heard of the film Last Year at Marienbad? No? Oh my God, I feel like Woody Allen made a parody of it. So this used to be a cultural reference, but I guess no more. I guess we're not supposed to know who Woody Allen is anymore anyway. He's been canceled. So Last Year at Marienbad is by a filmmaker, Alain Resnais, who did a very great film called Hiroshima, Mon Amour. It's a great film. You guys have heard of that? No? Oh. You gotta get into your Criterion collection. You have to try to watch some films from the Criterion collection. Anyway, and Marguerite Duras, who wrote Hiroshima, Mon Amour. She's associated also with the Nouveau Roman. So it's very objectivistic, like it's a very, like what postmodernists would call decentered subject, right? So it's a kind of literary writing that problematizes the narrative voice, but also the subjects of the characters. It's very like phenomenological. There's a lot of description. There's a lot of kind of objectivity in tone to the writing. So it sort of strips the narration of as much as possible psychology, and it's very ambiguous. And it's almost like a puzzle to work through, where to read a passage from it, you sometimes wonder what is going on at all here, like what's being described at all here. But it's nice. It's worth, if you ever have the opportunity to read. It's interesting writing, but it's a kind of late avant-garde literature, we might say. Post World War II, so contemporaneous with Barthes. So notice that there is a more definite literary object that attaches to what he's saying here. Right, so he's saying the new criticism that suspends the biography or the history context, as well as the more traditional criticism that neither would be able to do justice to the new literature, to the new writing. Right, the only thing that could do justice to it is recognizing the primacy of the reader, which comes not only at the cost of the death of the author, but also at the cost of the death of the critic. All right. Okay, here's Foucault with what is an author? The coming into being of the notion of author constitutes the privileged moment of individualization in the history of ideas, knowledge, literature, philosophy, and the sciences. Even today, when we reconstruct the history of a concept, literary genre, or school of philosophy, such categories seem relatively weak, secondary, and superimpose scansions in comparison with the solid and fundamental unit of the author and the work. I shall not offer here a socio-historical analysis of the author's persona. Certainly, it would be worth examining how the author became individualized in a culture like ours, what status he has been given, at what moment studies of authenticity and attribution began, in what kind of system of valorization the author was involved, at what point we begin to recount the lives of authors rather than of heroes, and how this fundamental category of the man and his work criticism began. For the moment, he says, I want to deal solely with the relationship between text and author, and with the manner in which the text points to this figure that, at least in appearance, is outside and antecedes it. Right, so he's covering a lot of the same ground as Barthes. Beckett. So you'll notice that Barthes invoked Bertolt Brecht. Now Foucault is going to invoke Samuel Beckett. Beckett also was a model for Lyotard, vis-a-vis postmodernism. Nicely formulates the theme with which I would like to begin. What does it matter who is speaking? Someone said. What does it matter who is speaking? It's that doubling is the point. In this indifference appears one of the fundamental ethical principles of contemporary writing, or écriture. I say ethical because this indifference is not really a trait characterizing the manner in which one speaks and writes, but rather a kind of immanent rule, taken up over and over again, never fully applied, not designating writing as something completed, but dominating it as a practice. Since it is too familiar to require a lengthy analysis, this immanent rule can be adequately illustrated here by tracing two of its major themes. First of all, we can say that today's writing has freed itself from the dimension of expression. So he's also taking up contemporary writing. Referring only to itself, but without being restricted to the confines of its interiority, writing is identified with its own unfolded exteriority. This means that it is an interplay of signs arranged less according to its signified content than according to the very nature of the signifier. The free play of the signifier, if you've heard that expression. Writing unfolds like a game that invariably goes beyond its own rules and transgresses its limits. In writing, the point is not to manifest or exalt the act of writing, nor is it to pin a subject within language. It is rather a question of creating a space into which the writing subject constantly disappears. The second theme, writing's relationship with death, is even more familiar. This link subverts an old tradition exemplified by the Greek epic, which was intended to perpetuate the immortality of the hero. If he was willing to die young, it was so that his life, consecrated and magnified by death, might pass into immortality. The narrative then redeemed this accepted death. In another way, the motivation, as well as the theme and the pretext of Arabian narratives, such as the 1001 Nights, was also the eluding of death. One spoke, telling stories into the early morning in order to forestall death, to postpone the day of reckoning that would silence the narrator. Shahrazad's narrative is an effort renewed each night to keep death outside the circle of life. Our culture has metamorphosed this idea of narrative or writing as something designed to ward off death. Writing has become linked to sacrifice, even to the sacrifice of life. It is now a voluntary effacement which does not need to be represented in books, since it is brought about in the writer's very existence. The work, which once had the duty of providing immortality, now possesses the right to kill, to be its author's murderer, as in the cases of Flaubert, Proust, and Kafka. That is not all, however. This relationship between writing and death is also manifested in the effacement of the writing subject's individual characteristics. Using all the contrivances that he sets up between himself and what he writes, the writing subject cancels out the signs of his particular individuality. As a result, the mark of the writer is reduced to nothing more than the singularity of his absence. He must assume the role of the dead man in the game of writing. None of this is recent. Criticism and philosophy took note of the disappearance or death of the author some time ago, but the consequences of this discovery of it have not been sufficiently examined, nor has its import been accurately measured. A certain number of notions that are intended to replace the privileged position of the author actually seem to preserve that privilege and suppress the real meaning of his disappearance. I shall examine two of these notions, both of great importance today. The first is the idea of the work. It's a very familiar thesis that the task of criticism is not to bring out the work's relationships with the author, nor to reconstruct through the text of thought or experience, but rather to analyze the work through its structure, its architecture, its intrinsic form, and the play of its internal relationships. At this point, however, a problem arises. What is a work? What is this curious unity which we designate as a work? Of what elements is it composed? Is it not what an author has written? Difficulties appear immediately. If an individual were not an author, could we say that what he wrote, said, left behind in his papers, or what has been collected of his remarks could be called a work? When de Sade was not considered an author, what was the status of his papers? Were they simply rolls of paper onto which he ceaselessly uncoiled his fantasies during his imprisonment? Even when an individual has been accepted as an author, we must still ask whether everything that he wrote, said, or left behind is part of his work. The problem is both theoretical and technical. When undertaking the publication of Nietzsche's works, for example, where should one stop? Surely everything must be published, but what is everything? Everything that Nietzsche himself published, certainly. And what about the rough drafts of his works? Obviously. The plans for his aphorisms, yes. The deleted passages and the notes at the bottom of the page, yes. What if, within a workbook filled with aphorisms, one finds a reference, the notation of a meeting or of an address, or a laundry list? Is it a work or not? Why not? And so on ad infinitum. How can one define a work amidst the millions of traces left by someone after his death? A theory of the work does not exist, and the empirical task of those who naively undertake the editing of works often suffers in the absence of such a theory. We could go even further. Does the 1001 Nights constitute a work? What about Clement of Alexandria's Miscellanies or Diogenes Laertius's Lives? A multitude of questions arises with regard to the notion of the work. Consequently, it is not enough to declare that we should do without the writer, the author, and study the work in itself. The word work and the unity that it designates are probably as problematic as the status of the author's individuality. Another notion which has hindered us from the taking full measure of the author's disappearance, blurring and concealing the moment of his effacement, and subtly preserving the author's existence, is the notion of writing. When rigorously applied, this notion should allow us not only to circumvent references to the author, but also to situate his recent absence. The notion of writing as currently employed is concerned with neither the act of writing, nor the indication, be it symptom or sign, of a meaning which someone might have wanted to express. We try with great effort to imagine the general condition of each text, the condition of both the space in which it is dispersed and the time in which it unfolds. In current usage, however, the notion of writing seems to transpose the empirical characteristics of the author into a transcendental anonymity. We are content to efface the more visible marks of the author's empiricity by playing off one against the other two ways of characterizing writing, namely the critical and the religious approaches. Giving writing a primal status seems to be a way of retranslating in transcendental terms both the theological affirmation of its sacred character and the critical affirmation of its creative character. To admit that writing is, because of the very history that made it possible, subject to the test of oblivion and repression, seems to represent in transcendental terms the religious principle of the hidden meaning, which requires interpretation, and the critical principle of implicit significations, silent determinations, and obscured contents, which gives rise to commentary. So like I said, not only do we have the sacred texts, we have scripture, but we also have endless commentaries on it and interpretations, which then become part of the religious tradition, in fact. To imagine writing as absence seems to be a simple repetition in transcendental terms of both the religious principle of inalterable and yet never fulfilled tradition, and the aesthetic principle of the work's survival, its perpetuation beyond the author's death, and its enigmatic excess in relation to him. This usage of the notion of writing runs the risk of maintaining the author's privileges under the protection of writing's a priori status. It keeps alive in the very gray light of neutralization the interplay of those representations that formed a particular image of the author. The author's disappearance, which since Mallarmé has been a constantly recurring event, is subject to a series of transcendental barriers. There seems to be an important dividing line between those who believe that they can still locate today's discontinuities or ruptures in the historico-transcendental tradition of the 19th century, and those who try to free themselves once and for all from that tradition. It is not enough to repeat the empty affirmation that the author has disappeared. For the same reason, it is not enough to keep repeating after Nietzsche that God and man have died a common death. Instead, we must locate the space left empty by the author's disappearance, follow the distribution of gaps and breaches, and watch for the openings that this disappearance uncovers. Okay. So the author function, let me jump ahead a little bit here. How much Foucault have you guys actually been exposed to previously? Some. He's pretty canonical now. So you'll notice that there are some themes that are abiding through his works. So one is power-knowledge discourse. Okay, so the idea is that every form of knowledge is also an exercise of power. And part of the power asserted by knowledge is to generate a discourse. Right, so discourse maintains power, it instantiates and maintains it. And again, knowledge is expressed in discourse, and knowledge is itself an assertion of power. It's a very Nietzschean idea. Or if you recall, on Truth and Lie in an extra moral sense. The issue of individuality and individualization is worth remarking here. So the idea is that language, epic, literature, scripture spoke a collective voice. It didn't speak an individual voice. It didn't speak the voice of an individual author or an individual person. Right, so the question is, what happens to that power of writing when its traditional source is replaced by the idea of the individual author? Right, so that's why with both Barthes and Foucault, it looks like the author is put in the place of God or in the place of the collective, meaning the author speaks on behalf of or as part of a collective. All right, let's see what he says. So on the one hand, authorship, in a way that you guys are more familiar with, establishes ownership, it establishes property, but it also establishes responsibility. So people are held accountable for their writing. So he says the author function does not affect all discourses in a universal and constant way, however. This is its second characteristic. In our civilization, it has not always been the same types of texts which have required attribution to an author. There was a time when the texts that we today call literary, narratives, stories, epics, tragedies, comedies, were accepted, put into circulation, and valorized, without any question about the identity of their author. Their anonymity caused no difficulties, since their ancientness, whether real or imagined, was regarded as a sufficient guarantee of their status. On the other hand, those texts that we now would call scientific, those dealing with cosmology and the heavens, medicine and illnesses, natural sciences and geography, were accepted in the Middle Ages and accepted as true only when marked with the name of their author. Hippocrates said, Pliny recounts, were not really formulas of an argument based on authority. They were the markers inserted into discourses that were supposed to be received as statements of demonstrated truth. A reversal occurred in the 17th or 18th centuries. Scientific discourses began to be received for themselves in the anonymity of an established or always redemonstrable truth in the scientific method. Their membership in a systematic ensemble, and not the reference to the individual who produced them, stood as their guarantee. The author function faded away, and the inventor's name served only to christen a theorem, proposition, particular effect, property, body, group of elements, or pathological syndrome. By the same token, literary discourses came to be accepted only when endowed with the author function. So science used to be authored, and literature was anonymous, and now science is anonymous and literature is authored. We now ask of each poetic or fictional text, from where does it come? Who wrote it? When? Under what circumstances? Or beginning with what design? The meaning ascribed to it and the status of value accorded it depend upon the manner in which we answer these questions. And if a text should be discovered in a state of anonymity, whether as a consequence of an accident or the author's explicit wish, the game becomes one of rediscovering the author. Since literary anonymity is not tolerable, we can accept it only in the guise of an enigma. As a result, the author function today plays an important role in our view of literary works. The third characteristic of this author function is that it does not develop spontaneously as the attribution of a discourse to an individual. It is rather the result of a complex operation which constructs a certain rational being that we call author. Critics doubtless try to give this intelligible being a realistic status by discerning in the individual a deep motive, a creative power, or a design, the milieu in which writing originates. Nevertheless, these aspects of an individual, which we designate as making him an author, are only a projection, in more or less psychologizing terms, of the operations that we force texts to undergo, the connections that we make, the traits that we establish as pertinent, the continuities that we recognize, or the exclusions that we practice. All these operations vary according to periods and types of discourse. We do not construct a philosophical author as we do a poet, just as in the 18th century one did not construct a novelist as we do today. Still, we can find through the ages certain constraints in the rules of author construction. I'm going to jump ahead here. But the author function is not a pure and simple reconstruction made secondhand from a text given as passive material. The text always contains a certain number of signs referring to the author. These signs, well known to grammarians, are personal pronouns, adverbs of time and place, and verb conjugation. Such elements do not play the same role in discourses provided with the author function as in those lacking it. In the latter, such shifters refer to the real speaker and to the spatio-temporal coordinates of his discourse. In the former, however, their role is more complex and variable. Everyone knows that in a novel narrated in the first person, neither the first person pronoun nor the present indicative refer exactly either to the writer or to the moment in which he writes, but rather to an alter ego whose distance from the author varies, often changing in the course of the work. Right, so we don't expect the I in a scientific article to be performative in the way that the I in a literary work is performative. It would just be as wrong to equate the author with the real writer as to equate him with the fictitious speaker. The author function is carried out and operates in the scission itself, in this division and this distance. No doubt, analysis could discover still more characteristic traits of the author function. I will limit myself to these four, however, because they seem to be the most visible and the most important. Foucault loves lists of things and enumerating. Number one, the author function is linked to the juridical and institutional system that encompasses, determines, and articulates the universe of discourses. Number two, it does not affect all discourses in the same way at all times and on all types of civilization. Number three, it is not defined by the spontaneous attribution of a discourse to its producer, but rather by a series of specific and complex operations. Number four, it does not refer purely and simply to a real individual, since it can give rise simultaneously to several selves, to several subject positions that can be occupied by different classes of individuals. Up to this point, I have unjustifiably limited my subject. Certainly the author function in painting, music, and other arts should have been discussed. But even supposing that we remain within the world of discourse, as I want to do, I seem to have given the term author much too narrow a meaning. I have discussed the author only in the limited sense of a person to whom the production of a text, a book, or a work can be legitimately attributed. It is easy to see that in the sphere of discourse, one can be the author of much more than a book. One can be the author of a theory, a tradition, or discipline, in which other books and authors will in their turn find a place. These authors are in a position which we can call transdiscursive. This is a recurring phenomenon, certainly as old as our civilization. Homer, Aristotle, and the Church Fathers, as well as the first mathematicians and originators of the Hippocratic tradition, all played this role. Furthermore, in the course of the 19th century, there appeared in Europe another, more uncommon kind of author, whom one should confuse with neither the great literary authors, nor the authors of religious texts, nor the founders of science. In a somewhat arbitrary way, we shall call those who belong to the last group founders of discursivity. Now, it's going to be interesting what his targets are here, and we'll talk a little bit about that. They are unique in that they are not just the authors of their own works, they have produced something else, the possibilities and the rules for the formation of other texts. In this sense, they are very different from, for example, from a novelist, who in fact is nothing more than the author of his own text. Freud is not just the author of the interpretation of dreams or jokes and their relation to the unconscious. Marx is not just the author of the Communist Manifesto or Capital. They have both established an endless possibility of discourse. So Freud and Marx are initiators of new discourses. Now, why is that significant? Why is that important? So in France, post-World War II, Marxism and Freudianism are very prominent, and Foucault has a beef with both of them. He dislikes both of them. So the French Communist Party is the most powerful political party in France, but it's kept out of political power for reasons of the Cold War. But a deal is made between Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the resistance, and the Communist Party, and the deal goes something like this. You will be represented in parliament, you'll run in elections, you will have a voice, you won't be part of any government, you won't be part of any governing coalition, but you can have academia. Similarly, Freudianism is big in the culture at large, in academia as well. Right, so Foucault, now what else would he be exercised about with respect to Freud and Marx? It's easy for us to forget what the significance of Freud and Marx are supposed to be, what they have in common. They're both supposed to liberate us. Freudian psychoanalysis is supposed to be about a liberation of the individual from neuroses, psychologically, a liberation from psychological unfreedom, a way of attaining psychological freedom. Marxism is supposed to free us. Instead, from Foucault's perspective, what have they done? So I think that we had on our syllabus, but we didn't discuss in class, the Nietzsche Genealogy Truth piece by Foucault, right, where he says, Nietzsche's great, except he still believes in freedom, like all those 19th century guys. So from Foucault's standpoint, what have these claims to freedom actually amounted to? What have these claims to liberation or emancipation actually amounted to? They've amounted to new forms of power. So they've initiated new discourses, but those new discourses are expressive of a new form of power. And indeed, new disciplines. Right, so discipline has been preached in the name of freedom. However, it's really an exercise of power. So Freud and Marx, in claiming to offer liberation, what they did instead was initiate new discourses, and those new discourses were exercises of power. They were new disciplining mechanisms. So a new way of disciplining people's psychology, Freudianism, and a new way of disciplining politics, Marxism. Right, so he says, look, Galileo didn't establish Galileoism. Right, so it's only Freud and Marx that have done this. Let me jump ahead here. So he says, in this way, we can understand the inevitable necessity within these fields of discursivity for a return to the origins. This return, which is part of the discursive field itself, never stops modifying it. The return is not a historical supplement, which would be added to the discursivity or merely an ornament. On the contrary, it constitutes an effective and necessary task of transforming the discursive practice itself. Re-examination of Galileo's text may well change our knowledge of the history of mechanics, but it will never be able to change mechanics itself. On the other hand, re-examining Freud's text modifies psychoanalysis itself, just as a re-examination of Marx's would modify Marxism. What I have just outlined regarding the initiation of discursive practices is, of course, very schematic. This is true in particular of the opposition that I have tried to draw between discursive initiation and scientific founding. All right, so he's also saying Freud and Marx tried to announce a liberation. They were really asserting power. They also announced a new science, but he's taking issue with that claim that they're scientific. It is not always easy to distinguish between the two, discursivity and science. Moreover, nothing proves that there are two mutually exclusive procedures. I have attempted the distinction for only one reason, to show that the author function, which is complex enough when one tries to situate it at the level of a book or a series of texts that carry a given signature, involves still more determining factors when one tries to analyze it in larger units, such as groups of works or entire disciplines. To conclude, I would like to review the reasons why I attach a certain importance to what I have said. Let me jump ahead here. Okay, here we go. So he says, the author is not an indefinite source of significations which fill a work. The author does not precede the works. He has a certain functional principle by which in our culture one limits, excludes, and chooses. In short, by which one impedes the free circulation, the free manipulation, the free composition, decomposition, and recomposition of fiction. In fact, if we are accustomed to presenting the author as a genius, as a perpetual surging of invention, it is because in reality we make him function in exactly the opposite fashion. One can say that the author is an ideological product, since we represent him as the opposite of his historically real function. When a historically given function is represented in a figure that inverts it, one has an ideological production. The author is therefore the ideological figure by which one marks the manner in which we fear the proliferation of meaning. Right, so again, the author is meant to discipline the possible meaning. In saying this, I seem to call for a form of culture in which fiction would not be limited by the figure of the author. It would be pure romanticism, however, to imagine a culture in which the fictive would operate in an absolutely free state, in which fiction would be put at the disposal of everyone and would develop without passing through something like a necessary or constraining figure. Although since the 18th century the author has played the role of the regulator of the fictive, a role quite characteristic of our era of industrial and bourgeois society, of individualism and private property, still, given the historical modifications that are taking place, it does not seem necessary that the author function remain constant in form, complexity, and even in existence. I think that, he says, as our society changes, at the very moment when it is in the process of changing, the author function will disappear, and in such a manner that fiction and its polysemic texts will once again function according to another mode, but still within a system of constraint, one which will no longer be the author, but which will have to be determined or perhaps experienced. All discourses, whatever their status, form, value, and whatever the treatment to which they will be subjected, would then develop in the anonymity of a murmur. We would no longer hear the questions that have been rehashed for so long. Who really spoke? Is it really he and not someone else? With what authenticity or originality? And what part of his deepest self did he express in this discourse? Instead, there would be other questions like these. What are the modes of existence of this discourse? Where has it been used? How can it circulate? And who can appropriate it for himself? What are the places in it where there is room for possible subjects? Who can assume these various subject functions? And behind all these questions, we would hear hardly anything but the stirring of an indifference. What difference does it make who is speaking? The Beckett quotation again. And I just wanted to point out that these questions, this is what we do now. We've become Foucauldian. Like, this has been definitely taken for marching orders for academia, especially in the humanities. Right. This is not really, or these two sets of questions exist maybe side by side, but very uncomfortably. And we've tried our best to go from the former to the latter. Okay, so as last time we talked about the sculpture in the expanded field, and I posed the question, have we really continued to unfold these cultural practices, or did it stop with that first level of unfolding, into supposed post-sculpture? And then the question is, was it rehabilitated back into sculpture? Meaning, rather than situating sculpture in an expanded field, did we just expand what counts as sculpture? Did what Rosalind Krauss wanted to happen? Like, did that play out or not? Similarly here, right? So Foucault thinks that his society is changing, in the process of changing, and that the author function will disappear and be replaced by another way of making meaning of things. Has that happened? Has that actually happened? Right? Even though we've tried to run with the Foucauldian questions rather than the traditional questions, it's not as if the author function has disappeared. It hasn't. So we've been left with the perpetual death of the author, but it never actually happens. Which might mean that we need to reconsider what the significance of that might be. All right. Oops. right, let's at least start getting into the crimp a little bit. Then we might take a break. So the end of painting. The end of painting. So do you guys know Daniel Buren's work? No? Some yes, some no? No? Let's first of all do that. He's the so-called stripe painting guy. All right, so you'll see his work installed. So it's a kind of in situ, it's installation. So for a while at the Art Institute Museum, when coming in the front entrance and then going through the past the security guard, and then you walk up the stairs to the galleries on the second floor. So in the stairs were these stripes. And so it just looked like a kind of a weird design. It's like, why are there stripes painted on the side of the stairs as you walk up the stairs? There was that installation of Daniel Buren's work at the Art Institute Museum at one point, and another point prior to that one, I think. There was one of the few galleries in the museum that's on the outside wall with a window. There was a telescope set up, and from the telescope it looked down Adams Street to the elevated train, and then the train would go by, and there'd be these stripes on the side of the train. So he's done this kind of stripe stuff in like many different ways. And the question is, what do we make of this? Again, the end of painting is what Douglas Crimp is going to interpret its meaning to be. That it is the defeat of the pictorial plane. So I think that we've previously discussed the difference between an image and a picture. So an image is the physical thing, the physical object. So it's, pigment on a surface. The picture is what our imagination makes of it. And of course, pictorial illusion, right? So the picture plane is where the picture happens. It's where the image becomes a picture. And there are various kinds of illusions by which the imagination constructs a picture out of the image. So if we think of painting and drawing as the art of line and color. So with line and color, can you have the imagination of the viewer see lines that are not drawn and colors that are not there? Also space. So obviously the trompe-l'oeil, the trick of the eye, the illusion of space that isn't there. Pictorial space. And we talked about Clement Greenberg describing the space in the picture that can be traversed by the eye and not by thought, meaning space that is purely visual in character and not physical in character. And we looked at The Lavender Mist by Jackson Pollock as an example of that. So the question is whether Daniel Buren's work means that there's no pictorial space, that the image and picture are the same, that there is no distinction between the picture and the image. And that's what would amount to the end of painting. Now, the end of painting, this kind of language of end, it's deliberately ambiguous. Namely, it can mean the termination, the terminus, but it could also mean the purpose, like the end, meaning the realization. So it could mean the kind of termination of something, or it can mean its realization, its purpose being realized. All right, so the question is whether painting sought to abolish itself, and how does an artist like Daniel Buren's work express that? All right. Okay. So here's Louis Aragon. So he's one of the surrealists. Painting has not always existed. We can determine when it began. And if its development and its moments of greatness can be drummed into our heads, can we not then also imagine its periods of decline and even its end like any other idea? Then he has a quote from Daniel Buren. The work of art is so frightened of the world at large, it so needs isolation in order to exist, that any conceivable means of protection will suffice. It frames itself, withdraws under glass, barricades itself behind a bulletproof surface, surrounds itself with a protective cordon, with instruments showing the room humidity, for even the slightest cold would be fatal. Ideally, the work of art finds itself not just screened from the world, but shut up in a safe, permanently and totally sheltered from the eye. And yet isn't such an extremism, bordering on the absurd, already with us, every day, everywhere, when the artwork exhibits itself in those safes called galleries and museums? Isn't it the very point of departure, the end, and the essential function of the work of art, that it should be so exhibited? All right, so again, with the stripes, what is it that makes the stripes into art? Is it just by virtue of being installed in the museum? All right, do you have to see the side of the train with the stripes on it from a room in the museum through a telescope set up in order for it to be a work of art? Well, I guess you'd also encounter it. You're waiting on the L platform, and the train pulls up and it has some strange stripes on it that has no discernible advertising function for commercial purposes. You might then say, oh, could it be art? Maybe it's art. All right. Let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and get into the meat of the Crimp article. Okay, let's resume. All right, so Douglas Crimp, he's one of the central authors of the October Art Journal, along with Rosalind Krauss. I mean, she's the head honcho, but he's her loyal sidekick for sure. So he takes aim at Barbara Rose in order to kind of set up what he's arguing against. On one of those rare occasions during the past decade when Barbara Rose abandoned the pages of Vogue magazine in order to say something really serious about the art of our time, she did so to vent her rage at an exhibit called 8 Contemporary Artists, held at the Museum of Modern Art in the fall of 1974. Although she found the work in the show bland and tepid, and therefore something normally one would overlook, she felt compelled to speak out because the show was organized by our most prestigious institution of modern art, and for that reason alone it became significant. But the work in the show was bland and tepid to Rose only from an aesthetic standpoint. It was more potent as politics. So Rose wrote, "For some time I have felt that the radicalism of minimal and conceptual art is fundamentally political, that its implicit aim is to discredit thoroughly the forms and institutions of dominant bourgeois culture. Whatever the outcome of such a strategy, one thing is certain: when an institution as prestigious as the Museum of Modern Art invites sabotage, it becomes party, not to the promulgation of experimental art, but to the passive acceptance of disenchanted, demoralized artists' aggression against art greater than their own." Whew. The particular saboteur who seems to have captured Rose's attention in this case is Daniel Buren, whose work for MoMA consisted of his familiar striped panels cut to conform to the windows facing the garden and affixed to the corridor wall facing those windows, and again to the garden wall, with leftover fragments displaced to a billboard and a gallery entrance in Lower Manhattan. Impressed though she is by the cogency of Buren's arguments about the ideology imposed by the museum, Rose is nevertheless perplexed that his work should appear in one, which seems to her like having his cake and eating it too. For illumination on this matter, she turns to an interview with William Rubin, the director of MoMA's Department of Painting and Sculpture. In this interview, published in a 1974 issue of Art Forum, Rubin explains that museums are essentially compromise institutions invented by bourgeois democracies to reconcile the large public with art conceived within the compass of elite private patronage. This age, Rubin suggests, might be coming to an end, leaving the museum essentially irrelevant to the practices of contemporary art. Perhaps looking back 10, 15, 30 years from now, Rubin says, it will appear that the modernist tradition really did come to an end within the last few years, as some critics suggest. If so, historians a century from now, whatever name they will give the period we now call modernism, will see it beginning shortly after the middle of the 19th century and ending in the 1960s. Perhaps the dividing line will be seen as between those works which essentially continue an easel painting concept that grew up associated with bourgeois democratic life and was involved with the development of private collections, as well as the museum concept. So we read the Daniel Sherman article on the museum. Between this and, let us say, earthworks, conceptual works, and related endeavors, which want another environment, or should want it, and perhaps another public. All right, so if you recall T.J. Clark, his definition of modernism in the debate with Michael Fried about the definition of modernism given by Greenberg and the legacy that had left, T.J. Clark, the student of Meyer Shapiro, he said that modernism was bourgeois art without a bourgeois public. It's bourgeois art without a bourgeois public. And his example that he and Fried talked about was Gustave Courbet, the Burial at Ornans that we looked at in class. And we also recalled at that time that Greenberg called Courbet the first avant-garde painter, as opposed to Manet as the first modernist painter, even though the distinction between modernism and avant-gardism wasn't as sharp for Greenberg as it became for the postmodernists. All right, but generally speaking, in fact, what seemed to happen in the 60s also could plausibly have been said to have happened previously. So maybe circa 1848, in the 1850s and 60s, also circa World War I, the 20th century avant-garde into the 20s and 30s. Right, so it didn't just happen in the 60s, nonetheless. Right. So bourgeois art without a bourgeois public. That paradox, if you will. Rose, according to Crimp, assumes that Buren is one of those artists whose work wants, or should want, another environment. After all, his text, Function of the Museum, which she quotes, is a polemic against the confinement of artworks in museums. But if Buren's work had not appeared in the museum, had not taken the museum as its point of departure and as its referent, the very issues Rose is pondering would never have arisen. It is fundamental to Buren's work that it act in complicity with those very institutions that it seeks to make visible as the necessary conditions of the artwork's intelligibility. Now, you'll also recall that Susan Buck-Morse, in the reading that we did in the first week of class, she said that artists in the 90s were in the paradoxical position of attacking the very institution that maintains the illusion that art exists, namely the museum, and all the related institutions, like the dealer-critic gallery system, the art schools, academia. That is the reason not only that his work appears in museums and galleries, but that it poses as painting. It is only thereby possible for his work to ask, what makes it possible to see a painting? What makes it possible to see a painting as a painting? And to what end is painting under such conditions of its presentation? So again, the end meaning terminus, but end also meaning purpose. But Buren's work runs a great risk when it poses as painting, the risk of invisibility. So it's to make visible, but it also runs the risk of becoming invisible. Since everything to which Buren's work points as being cultural, historical, is so easily taken to be natural, many people look at Buren's paintings the way they look at all paintings, vainly asking them to render up their meaning about themselves. Since they categorically refuse to do so, since they have, by design, no internal meaning, they simply disappear. Thus, Barbara Rose, for example, sees Buren's work at the Museum of Modern Art only as vaguely resembling Stella's stripe paintings. But if Rose is myopic on matters of painting, blind to those questions about painting which Buren's work poses, that is because she, like most people, still believes in painting. All right, now this is a great quotation. And we'll see what Crimp does with it. But it's a great quotation nonetheless. So this is Gerhard Richter. One must really be engaged in order to be a painter. Once obsessed by it, one eventually gets to the point where one thinks that humanity could be changed by painting. But when that passion deserts you, there is nothing else left to do. Then it is better to stop altogether, because basically painting is pure idiocy. Okay, so, and actually it's a very precise meaning of idiocy. Idiocy means like a repetitive activity, right? So now we'll see that Crimp turns that into a more positive statement, namely that Buren's work is embracing painting becoming pure idiocy. So where Gerhard Richter is saying what prevents painting from becoming pure idiocy, Crimp is saying, no, we need to go with painting as pure idiocy. So it's a function of belief. So belief for Crimp, passion for Richter. As testimony to her faith in painting, belief in faith, Rose mounted her own exhibition of contemporary art 5 years after the MoMA show. Given the forward-looking, not to say oracular title, American Painting, the 80s, the exhibition was mounted in the fall of 1979. Rose's exhibition expressly intended to show the public that throughout that grim period of the 60s and 70s, when art seemed so bent on self-destruction, intent as it was on those extra art concerns gathered together under the rubric politics, that throughout that period there had been a generation of holdouts, survivors of disintegrating morality, social demoralization, and lack of conviction in all authority and tradition. These noble survivors, painters all, were, quote, maintaining a conviction in quality and values, a belief in art as a mode of transcendence, a worldly incarnation of the ideal. So, of course, Rose meant all of that earnestly, and Crimp is quoting it contemptuously. Now, as it happens, Rose's evidence of this keeping of the faith was extremely unconvincing, and her exhibition was an easy target for hostile criticism, biased as her selection was toward the most hackneyed recapitulations of late modernist abstraction. The show had the unmistakable look of 10th Street, 20 years after the fact. Given the thousands of artists currently practicing the art of painting, Rose's selection was indeed parochial. Certainly there is a lot of painting around that looks more original. Furthermore, favoring such a narrow range of painting at a time when stylistic Catholicity, pluralism, is the critical byword. Rose was virtually inviting an unfavorable response. And so, as was to be expected, she was taken to task by the various art journalists for whomever of their favorites she failed to include. Thus, Hilton Kramer's review asked, "Where are the figurative painters?" And John Perrault asked, "Where are the pattern painters?" And Roberta Smith asked, "Where is Jennifer Bartlett?" But the point is that no one asked, why painting? To what end painting in the 1980s? And to that extent, Barbara Rose's show was a resounding success. It proved that faith in painting had indeed been fully restored. For however much painting may have been in question in 1974, when Rubin was interviewed by Art Forum, and his museum staged 8 contemporary artists, by 1979 the question clearly had been withdrawn. So what else is going on in 1979? So Margaret Thatcher was elected in the UK, and Ronald Reagan was running for president and would be elected in 1980. All right, so the end of the 60s. Right, the definitive end of the 60s. The long 60s into the 70s. The rhetoric which accompanies this resurrection of painting is almost exclusively reactionary. So reactionary meaning turning back the clock. It reacts specifically against all those art practices of the 60s and 70s which abandoned painting and coherently placed in question the ideological supports of painting, and the ideology which painting in turn supports. And thus, while almost no one agreed with the choices Barbara Rose made to demonstrate painting's renaissance, almost everyone agrees with the substance, if not the details, of her rhetoric. Rose's catalog text for American painting in the 80s is a dazzling collection of received ideas about the art of painting, and I would submit that it is only such ideas that painting today knows. Here then is a litany of excerpts from Rose's essay, which I think we may take as provisional answers to the question, to what end painting in the 1980s? Painting is a transcendental high art, a major art, and an art of universal as opposed to topical significance. Only painting is genuinely liberal in the sense of free. Painting is an expressive human activity, our only present hope for preserving high art. Painting is the product exclusively of the individual imagination rather than a mirror of the ephemeral external world of objective reality. Illusion is the essence of painting. Today, the essence of painting is being redefined not as a narrow, arid, and reductive anti-illusionism, but as a rich, varied capacity to birth new images into an old world. Painting's capacity is to materialize an image behind the proverbial looking glass of consciousness, where the depth of the imagination knows no bounds. Not innovation, but originality, individuality, and synthesis are the marks of quality in art today, as they have always been. Art is labor, physical human labor, the labor of birth, reflected in the many images that appear as in a process of emergence, as if taking form before us. The liberating potential of art is a catharsis of the imagination. These paintings are clearly the works of rational human adults, not a monkey, not a child, or a lunatic. The tradition of painting is an inner world of stored images ranging from Altamira to Pollock. Close quote. For Rose, then, painting is a high art, a universal art, a liberal art, an art through which we can achieve transcendence and catharsis. Painting has an essence, and that essence is illusion. Painting is a great unbroken tradition that encompasses the entire known history of man. Painting is above all human. All of this, of course, in direct opposition to that art of the 60s and 70s, of which Crimp says, I take Buren's work to be exemplary, which sought to contest the myths of high art, to declare art, like all other forms of endeavor, to be contingent upon the real historical world. Moreover, this art sought to discredit the myth of man and the ideology of humanism which it supports. For indeed, these are all notions that sustain the dominant bourgeois culture. They are the very hallmarks of bourgeois ideology. But if the art of the 60s and 70s sought to contest the myth of man as an eternal essence with its open assault upon the artist as a unique creator, There was another phenomenon which had initiated that assault in the arts at the very founding moments of modernism, a phenomenon from which painting has been in retreat since the mid-19th century. That phenomenon is, of course, photography. And then he quotes Marcel Duchamp in a letter to Alfred Stieglitz, quote, "You know exactly what I think of photography. I would like to see it make people despise painting until something else will make photography unbearable." From today, painting is dead. It is now nearly a century and a half since Paul Delaroche is said to have pronounced that sentence in the face of the overwhelming evidence of Daguerre's invention. But even though that death warrant has been periodically reissued throughout the era of modernism, no one seems to have been entirely willing to execute it. Life on death row lingered to longevity. But during the 1960s, painting's terminal condition finally seemed impossible to ignore. The symptoms were everywhere. In the work of the painters themselves, each of whom seemed to be reiterating Reinhardt's claim that he was, quote, just making the last paintings which anyone can make, or to allow their paintings to be contaminated with such alien forces as photographic images, in minimal sculpture, which provided a definitive rupture with painting's unavoidable ties to century-old idealism, and in all those other mediums to which artists turned as they, one after the other, abandoned painting. The dimension that had always resisted even painting's most dazzling feats of illusionism, time, now became the arena in which artists staged their activities as they embraced film, video, and performance. And after waiting out the entire era of modernism, photography reappeared finally to reclaim its inheritance. The appetite for photography in the past decade has been insatiable. Artists, critics, dealers, curators, scholars have defected from their former pursuits in droves to take up this enemy of painting. Photography may have been invented in 1839, but was only discovered in the 1970s. But what's all this about photography? Okay, so you'll recall, however, we read Benjamin's Little History of Photography, as well as Krakauer's photography. And the question was, and Baudelaire had raised it, photography as art and art as photography. That was really the question. And we'll see that Crimp also follows this idea, meaning that not only did photography represent a certain kind of crisis or terminus for the art of painting, but it also raised the question of what art is at all. So he has another reactionary critic, he claims, Richard Hennessy, one of Rose's American painters of the 80s. And he quotes him, Crimp quotes Hennessy, "The role of intention, and its poetry of human freedom is infrequently discussed in relation to art. Yet the more a given art is capable of making intention felt, the greater are its chances of being a fine and not a minor or applied art. Consider the paintbrush. How many bristles or hairs does it have? Sometimes 20 or less, sometimes 500, 1,000, more. When a brush loaded with pigment touches the surface, it can leave not just a single mark, but the marks of the bristles of which it is composed. The 'yes, I desire this' of the stroke is supported by the choir of the bristles, 'yes, we desire this.' The whole question of touch is rife with spiritual associations. Imagine the magnitude of that choir bristling so with desire as to produce a deafening roar of hallelujahs in the particular case of Robert Ryman's Delta series, paintings which employed, quote, this is Crimp, very wide brush, 12 inches. I got it specially. I went to a brush manufacturer and they had this very big brush. I wanted to pull the paint across this quite large surface, 9 feet square, with this big brush. I had a few failures at the beginning. Finally, I got the consistency right, and I knew what I was doing and how hard to push the brush and pull it and what was going to happen when I did. That's kind of the way to begin. I didn't have anything else in mind except to make a painting. Juxtaposed against Hennessy's prose, Ryman's words sound flat indeed. His conception of painting is reduced to the stark physical components of painting as object. So again, the image. The systematic, single-minded, persistent attempt to once and for all empty painting of its idealist trappings gives to Ryman's work its special place during the 1960s, as again, just the last paintings which anyone can make. And that is as well their very condition of possibility. Ryman's paintings, like Buren's, make visible the most material of painting's conventions, its frame, its stretcher, its supporting surface, the walls on which it hangs. But more significantly, his paintings, unlike Buren's, make visible the very mechanical activity of laying on the brushstrokes, as they are manifestly lined up one after the other, left to right, row after row, until the surface is simply painted. Okay, and he invokes Foucault and Velázquez's Las Meninas. Did we look at Las Meninas in this class? I think no, we did not. Let's see what Crimp has to say. He's going to quote Foucault on Las Meninas. As Michel Foucault describes it, this is indeed a painting in which the artist on the one hand and the spectator on the other have usurped the position of the subject, who is displaced to the vague reflection in the mirror on the rear wall of Velázquez's palace studio. For within the 17th century's theory of representation, these parallel usurpations and displacements were the very ground of representation's possibility. Quote, this is Foucault, "It may be that in this picture, as in all the representations of which it is, as it were, the manifest essence, the profound invisibility of what one sees is inseparable from the invisibility of the person seeing, despite all the mirrors, reflections, imitations, and portraits. Perhaps there exists in this picture by Velázquez the representation, as it were, of classical representation, so representation of representation, and the definition of the space it opens up to us. And indeed, representation undertakes to represent itself here in all its elements, with its images, the eyes to which it is offered, the faces it makes visible, the gestures that call it into being. But there, in the midst of this dispersion, which it's simultaneously grouping together and spreading out before us, indicated compellingly from every side, is an essential void, the necessary disappearance of that which is its foundation, of the person it resembles, and the person in whose eyes it is only a resemblance. This very subject, which is the same, has been elided, and representation, freed from the relation that was impeding it, can offer itself as representation in its pure form." Close quote. Here's Crimp. What Foucault sees when he looks at this painting, then, is the way representation functioned in the classical period, a period which came to an end in Foucault's archaeological analysis of history at the beginning of the 19th century, when our own age, the age of modernism, began. And of course, if this era of history came to an end, so did its modes of understanding the world, of which Las Meninas is the very great example. It's going to choke out on me. Okay, here we go. Good. Oops, not letting me zoom. Oops, that's too large an image. That's why it was taking so long. Sorry. For Hennessy, however, Las Meninas does not signal a particular historical period with its particular mode of knowledge. For Hennessy, Las Meninas is more essentially than anything else a painting, governed not by history but by creative genius, which is ahistorical, eternal, like man himself. This position is the very one that Foucault's enterprise is determined to overturn, the position of an entrenched historicism. From such a position, painting is understood as an eternal essence, of which Las Meninas is one instance, the marks on the walls of Altamira another, the poured skeins of Jackson Pollock another. From Altamira to Pollock, that phrase encapsulates the argument that man has always had the impulse to create paintings. How then can it even be thinkable that he could stop in 1965? But what is it that makes it possible to look at Paleolithic cave painting, a 17th century court portrait, and an abstract expressionist canvas and say that they are all the same thing, that they all belong to the same category of knowledge? How did this historicism of art get put in place? Jump ahead. Goes back to Buren. All right, so quoting Buren again, it is no longer a matter of criticizing works of art in their meaning, aesthetic, philosophical, or otherwise. It is no longer a matter even of knowing how to make a work of art, an object, a painting, how to become inserted in the history of art, nor even of asking oneself the question whether it is interesting or not, essential or ridiculous, to create a work of art. How, if you are or desire to be an artist, or if you challenge that word, to fit in with the game so as to play it with your own tools and to the best of your ability, it is no longer a matter even of challenging the artistic system. Neither is it a matter of taking delight in one's interminable analysis. The ambition of this work is quite different. It aims at nothing less than abolishing the code that has until now made art what it is in its production and in its institutions. That's Daniel Buren again. Oops, sorry. All right. Buren's work has been exhibited more extensively than that of any other painter in the past decade, and although it has been seen in galleries and museums, as well as in the streets, all over the world, probably by more people than have seen the work of any other contemporary artist, it has thus far remained invisible to all but a few. This paradoxical situation is testimony to the success of Buren's gambit, as well as to the seemingly unshakable faith in painting, which is to say, the code. When Buren decided in 1965 to make only works in situ, always using 8.7 centimeter wide vertical stripes, alternating colored with white or transparent, he obviously made a wise choice. For just as he predicted, this format has not been assimilable to the codes of art, regardless of how elastic those codes have been in the past 15 years. As we have seen, even such bizarre hybrids as Stella's recent constructions can easily be taken for paintings, though certainly they are not, and as such they can be understood to continue painting as usual. In a climate in which Stella's historical constructions can so readily be seen as paintings, it is understandable that Buren's work cannot. It is therefore not surprising that Buren is widely regarded as a conceptual artist who is unconcerned with the visible, or what Duchamp called the retinal, aspects of painting. But Buren has always insisted specifically on the visibility of his work, the necessity for it to be seen. For he knows only too well that when his stripes are seen as painting, painting will be understood as the pure idiocy that it is. At the moment when Buren's work becomes visible, the code of painting will have been abolished, and Buren's repetitions can stop. The end of painting will have finally been acknowledged. Okay, so that has not happened. That has not happened. And so Buren's work is still exhibited. It's still seen But the end of painting has not been acknowledged. And there are questions about whether this is actually what Crimp is saying is actually what Buren was trying to accomplish. Again, pictorial illusion does not seem to be entirely absent from Buren's work. Let me find some examples. Here's one. Sorry. There's one in particular I'm wanting us to look at. Oops. I lost on that. Oh my god, they got too much stuff going on here. Well, here's actually one that's good. I don't know if we can say that this is without pictorial illusion. Oh my god, they got too many examples. I was looking for one in particular. Here we go. All right. This one. So notice some things about this. One is that it's tilted, so it introduces a dynamic to the stripes. The other is that it's on the wall and the floor. And then finally, it's not painted over the wall molding, but the wall molding is cut out from the painting. Right, so the pictorial surface is not interrupted, as it would be if it had been painted over the moldings. So one sees more than just the physical object. One doesn't just see the physical object. In other words, one does see a painting. And not simply because we insist on it, or even because Buren necessarily intended it, but because our imagination makes more of it than is there. All right, still playing with the imagination. It's not just demonstrating a code. And again, he's continued to make it long after, 40 years after Crimp wrote his article. So not just 15 years from 1965 to when Crimp wrote his article, but I'm trying to think of 2019. I saw some Buren installed in some galleries in Paris. Okay. What are we doing for time? Okay, we've got a little bit of time. Here's Rosalind Krauss, the originality of the avant-garde, a postmodernist repetition. Okay, so first of all, let me So she's talking about The Gates of Hell by Rodin, which includes other Rodin figures that we're familiar with, like the Thinker. Okay. So she says, or writes, this summer, the National Gallery in Washington installed what it proudly describes as the largest Rodin exhibition ever. Not only was this the greatest public gathering of Rodin's sculpture, but it included as well much of his work never before seen. In certain cases, the work had not been seen because it consisted of pieces in plaster that had lain on the shelves in storage at Meudon since the artist's death, closed off to the prying eyes of scholars and public alike. In other instances, the work had not been seen because it had only just been made. The National Gallery's exhibition included, for example, a brand new cast of The Gates of Hell, so absolutely recent that visitors to the exhibition were able to sit down in a little theater, provided for the occasion, to view a just completed movie of the casting and finishing of this new version. To some, though hardly all, of the people sitting in that theater watching the casting of The Gates of Hell, it must have occurred that they were witnessing the making of a fake. After all, Rodin had been dead since 1918, and surely a work of his produced more than 60 years after his death cannot be the genuine article, cannot, that is, be an original. The answer to this is more interesting than one would think, for the answer is neither yes nor no. When Rodin died, he left the French nation his entire estate, which consisted not only of all the work in his possession, but also all of the rights of its reproduction, that is, the right to make bronze editions from the estate's plasters. The Chamber of Deputies, in accepting this gift, decided to limit the posthumous editions to 12 casts of any given plaster. Thus, The Gates of Hell, cast in 1978, by perfect right of the state, is a legitimate work, a real original, we might say. But once we leave the lawyer's office and the terms of Rodin's will, we fall immediately into a quagmire. In what sense is the new cast an original? At the time of Rodin's death, The Gates of Hell stood in his studio like a mammoth plaster chessboard, with all the pieces removed and scattered on the floor. The arrangement of the figures on the gates, that, as we know it, reflects the most current notion the sculpture had about its composition, an arrangement documented by numbers penciled on the plasters corresponding to numbers located at various stations on the gates. But these numbers were regularly changed as Rodin played with and recomposed the surface of the doors, and so at the time of his death the gates were very much unfinished. They were also uncast. Since they had originally been commissioned and paid for by the state, they were of course not Rodin's to issue in bronze, even had he chosen to do so. But the building for which they had been commissioned had been cancelled. The gates were never called for, hence never finished and thus never cast. The first bronze was made in 1921, 3 years after the artist's death. So in finishing and patinating, the new cast, there is no example completed during Rodin's lifetime to use as a guide to the artist's intentions about how the finished piece was to look. Due to the double circumstance of there being no lifetime cast, and at the time of death, of there existing a plaster model still in flux, we could say that all the casts of The Gates of Hell are examples of multiple copies that could exist in the absence of an original. The issue of authenticity is equally problematic for each of the existing casts. It is only more conspicuously so for the most recent. But, as we have constantly been reminding ourselves ever since Walter Benjamin's work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, authenticity empties out as a notion as one approaches those mediums which are inherently multiple. Quote, from a photographic negative, for example, Benjamin argued, one can make any number of prints. To ask for the authentic print makes no sense. For Rodin, the concept of the authentic bronze cast seems to have made as little sense as it has for many photographers. Like Atget's thousands of glass negatives for which in some cases no lifetime prints exist, Rodin left many of his plaster figures unrealized in any permanent material, either bronze or marble. Like Cartier-Bresson, who never printed his own photographs, Rodin's relation to the casting of his sculpture could only be called remote. Much of it was done in foundries to which Rodin never went while the production was in progress, He never worked on or retouched the waxes from which the final bronzes were cast, never supervised or regulated either the finishing or the patination, in the end never checked the pieces before they were crated to be shipped to the client or dealer who had bought them. From his position deep in the ethos of mechanical reproduction, it was not as odd for Rodin as we might have thought to have willed his country's posthumous authorial rights over his own work. The ethos of reproduction in which Rodin was immersed was not limited, of course, to the relatively technical question of what went on at the foundry. It was installed within the very walls, heavy with plaster dust, the blinding snow of Rilke's description of Rodin's studio. For the plasters that form the core of Rodin's work were themselves casts. They are thus potential multiples, and at the core of Rodin's massive output is the structural proliferation born of this multiplicity. Jump ahead here. So she's going to quote Rilke. Bodies that listen like faces and lift themselves like arms, chains of bodies, garlands, and single organisms, bodies that listen like faces and lift tendrils and heavy clusters of bodies into which sin's sweetness rises, but out of the roots of pain. The army of these figures became much too numerous to fit into the frame and wings of the gates of hell. Rodin made choice after choice and eliminated everything that was too solitary to subject itself to the great totality. Everything that was not necessary was rejected. The swarm of figures that Rilke evokes is, we are led to believe, composed of different figures, and we are encouraged in this belief by the cult of originality that grew up around Rodin, one that he himself invited. From the kind of reflexively intended hand of God imagery of Rodin's own work to his carefully staged publicity, as in his famous portrait of Genius Progenitor by Edward Steichen, Rodin courted the notion of himself as form giver, creator, crucible of originality. Rilke chants, quote, "One walks among these thousand forms, overwhelmed with the imagination and the craftsmanship which they represent, and involuntarily one looks for the two hands out of which this world has arisen. One asks for the man who directs these hands." Henry James in The Ambassadors had added, with his genius in his eyes, his manners on his lips, his long career behind him, and his honors and rewards all around, the great artist affected our friend as a dizzying prodigy of type, with a personal luster almost violent. He shone in a constellation. What are we to make of this little chapter of the human comedy, in which the artist of the last century, most driven to the celebration of his own originality and of the autographic character of his own kneading of matter into formal life, that artist should have given his own work over to the afterlife of mechanical reproduction? Are we to think that in this peculiar last testimony, Rodin acknowledged the extent to which his was an art of reproduction, of multiples without originals? But at a second remove, what are we to make of our own squeamishness at the thought of the future of posthumous casting that awaits Rodin's work? Are we not involved here in clinging to a culture of originals which has no place among the reproductive mediums? Within the current photography market, this culture of the original, the vintage print, is hard at work. The vintage print is specified as one made close to the aesthetic moment, and thus an object made not only by the photographer himself, but produced as well contemporaneously with the taking of the image. This is, of course, a mechanical view of authorship, one that does not acknowledge that some photographers are less good printers than the printers they hire, or that years after the fact, photographers re-edit and recrop older images, sometimes vastly improving them, or that it is possible to recreate old papers and old chemical compounds, and thus to resurrect the look of the 19th century vintage print, so that authenticity need not be a function of the history of technology. But the formula that specifies a photographic original as a print made close to the aesthetic moment is obviously a formula dictated by the art historical notion of period style and applied to the practice of connoisseurship. A period style is a special form of coherence that cannot be fraudulently breached. The authenticity folded into the concept of style is a product of the way style is conceived as having been generated, that is, collectively and unconsciously. Thus, an individual could not, by definition, consciously will a style. Later copies will be exposed precisely because they are not of the period. It is exactly that shift into sensibility that will get the chiaroscuro wrong, make the outlines too harsh or too muddy, disrupt the older patterns of coherence. It is this concept of period style that we feel the 1978 cast of The Gates of Hell will violate. We do not care if the copyright papers are all in order, for what is at stake are the aesthetic rights of style based on a culture of originals. Sitting in the little theater, watching out the newest gates being cast, watching this violation, we want to call out fraud. Now, why should one begin a discussion of avant-garde art with a story about Rodin and casts and copyrights? Particularly since Rodin strikes one as the very last artist to introduce the subject, so popular was he during his lifetime, so celebrated, and so quickly induced to participate in the transformation of his own work into kitsch. The avant-garde artist has worn many guises over the first 100 years of his existence: revolutionary, dandy, anarchist, aesthete, technologist, mystic. He has also preached a variety of creeds. One thing only seems to hold fairly constant in the vanguardist discourse, and that is the theme of originality. By originality here, I mean more than just the kind of revolt against tradition that echoes in Ezra Pound's Make It New, or sounds in the futurists' promise to destroy the museums that cover Italy, as though with countless cemeteries. More than a rejection or dissolution of the past, avant-garde originality is conceived as a literal as a literal origin, a beginning from ground zero, a birth. Marinetti, thrown from his automobile one evening in 1909 into a factory ditch filled with water, emerges as if from amniotic fluid to be born, without ancestors, a futurist. This parable of absolute self-creation that begins the first futurist manifesto functions as a model for what is meant by originality among the early 20th century avant-garde. For originality becomes an organicist metaphor referring not so much to formal invention as to sources of life. The self as origin is safe from contamination by tradition because it possesses a kind of originary naivete. Hence Brancusi's dictum, quote, "When we are no longer children, we are already dead." Where again, the self as origin has the potential for continual acts of regeneration, a perpetuation of self-birth. Hence Malevich's pronouncement, quote, "Only he is alive who rejects his convictions of yesterday." The self as origin is the way an absolute distinction can be made between a present experienced de novo and a tradition laden past. The claims of the avant-garde are precisely these claims to originality. I'm going to jump ahead here. Perhaps it is because of this sense of a beginning, a fresh start, a ground zero, that artist after artist has taken up the grid as the medium within which to work, always taking it up as though he were just discovering it, as though the origin he had found by peeling back layer after layer of representation to come at last to the schematized reduction. This graph paper ground were his origin, and is finding it an act of originality. Waves of abstract artists discover the grid. Part of its structure, one could say, is that in its revelatory character, it is always a new, a unique discovery. But just as the grid is a stereotype that is constantly being paradoxically rediscovered, it is, as a further paradox, a prison in which the caged artist feels at liberty. For what is striking about the grid is that while it is most effective as a badge of freedom, it is extremely restrictive in the actual exercise of freedom. Without doubt, the most formulaic construction that could possibly be mapped on a plane surface, the grid is also highly inflexible. Thus, just as no one could claim to have invented it, so once one is involved in deploying it, the grid is extremely difficult to use in the service of invention. And thus, when we examine the careers of those artists who have been most committed to the grid, we could say that from the time they submit themselves to the structure, their work virtually ceases to develop and becomes involved instead in repetition. Exemplary artists in this respect are Mondrian, Albers, Reinhardt, and Agnes Martin. But in saying that the grid condemns these artists not to originality but to repetition, I'm not suggesting a negative description of their work. I'm trying instead to focus on a pair of terms, originality and repetition, and to look at their coupling unprejudicially. For within the instance we are examining, these two terms seem bound together in a kind of aesthetic economy, interdependent and mutually sustaining, although the one, originality, is the valorized term, and the other, repetition or copy or reduplication, is discredited. We have already seen that the avant-garde artist above all claims originality as his right, his birthright, so to speak. With his own self as the origin of his work, that production will have the same uniqueness as he. The condition of his own singularity will guarantee the originality of what he makes. Having given himself this warrant, he goes on, in the example we are looking at, to enact his originality in the creation of grids. Yet, as we have seen, not only is he, the artist, X, Y, or Z, not the inventor of the grid, but no one can claim this patent. The copyright expired sometime in antiquity, and for many centuries this figure has been in the public domain. Structurally, logically, axiomatically, the grid can only be repeated, and with an act of repetition or replication as the original occasion of its usage within the experience of a given artist. The extended life of the grid in the unfolding progression of his work will be one of still more repetition as the artist engages in repeated acts of self-imitation. That so many generations of 20th century artists should have maneuvered themselves into this particular position of paradox, where they are condemned to repeating as if by compulsion the logically fraudulent original, is truly compelling. But it is no more compelling than that other complementary fiction, the illusion not of the originality of the artist, but of the originary status of the pictorial surface. This origin is what the genius of the grid is supposed to manifest to us viewers, an indispensable zero ground beyond which there is no further model or referent or text, except that this experience of originariness, felt by generations of artists, critics, and viewers, is itself false, a fiction. The canvas, surface, and the grid that scores it do not fuse into that absolute unity necessary to the notion of an origin, for the grid follows the canvas surface, doubles it, is a representation of the surface, mapped, it is true, onto the same surface it represents, but even so the grid remains a figure, picturing various aspects of the originary object. Through its mesh, it creates an image of the woven infrastructure of the canvas. Through its network of coordinates, it organizes a metaphor for the plane geometry of the field. Through its repetition, it configures the spread of lateral continuity. The grid thus does not reveal the surface, laying it bare at last, rather it veils it through a repetition. All right. Then she comes around to Sherry Levine. What would it look like not to repress the concept of the copy? What would it look like to produce a work that acted out the discourse of reproductions without originals, that discourse which could only operate in Mondrian's work as the inevitable subversion of his purpose, the residue of representationality that he could not sufficiently purge from the domain of his painting? The answer to this, or at least one answer, is that it would look like a certain kind of play with the notions of photographic reproduction that begins in the silkscreen canvases of Robert Rauschenberg and has recently flowered in the work of a group of younger artists whose production has been identified by the critical term pictures. I will focus on the example of Sherry Levine because it seems most radically to question the concept of origin and with it the notion of originality. And we're going to come back to Robert Rauschenberg in the final week of readings. Levine's medium is the pirated print, as in the series of photographs she made by taking images by Edward Weston of his young son Neil and simply rephotographing them in violation of Weston's copyright. But as has been pointed out about Weston's originals, these are already taken from models provided by others. They are given in that long series of Greek chorai by which the nude male torso has long ago been processed and multiplied within our culture. Levine's act of theft, which takes place, so to speak, in front of the surface of Weston's print, opens the print from behind to the series of models from which it, in turn, has stolen, of which it is itself the reproduction. The discourse of the copy, within which Levine's act must be located, has, of course, been developed by a variety of writers, among them Roland Barthes. I am thinking of his characterization in SZ of the realist as certainly not a copyist from nature, but rather a pasticher, or someone who makes copies of copies. As Barthes says, to depict is to refer not from a language to a referent, but from one code to another. Thus, realism consists not in copying the real, but in copying a depicted copy. Through secondary mimesis, realism copies what is already a copy. In another series by Levine, in which the lush colored landscapes of Eliot Porter are reproduced, we again move through the original print back to the origin in nature, and as in the model of the picturesque, through another trapdoor at the back wall of nature, into the purely textual construction of the sublime and its history of degeneration into ever more lurid copies. Now, insofar as Levine's work explicitly deconstructs the modernist notion of origin, her effort cannot be seen as an extension of modernism. It is, like the discourse of the copy, postmodernist, which means that it cannot be seen as avant-garde either. Because of the critical attack it launches on the tradition that precedes it, we might want to see the move made in Levine's work as yet another step in the forward march of the avant-garde. But this would be mistaken. In deconstructing the sister notions of origin and originality, postmodernism establishes a schism between itself and the conceptual domain of the avant-garde, looking back at it from across a gulf that in turn establishes a historical divide. The historical period that the avant-garde shared with modernism is over. That seems an obvious fact. What makes it more than a journalistic one is a conception of the discourse that has brought it to a close. This is a complex of cultural practices, among them a demythologizing criticism and a truly postmodernist art, both of them acting now to void the basic propositions of modernism, to liquidate them by exposing their fictitious condition. It is thus from a strange new perspective that we look back on the modernist origin and watch it splintering into endless replication. I don't think she doesn't have a picture of the Edward Weston. She only has the Eliot Porter. Have you guys ever seen Cher Levine's work? Have you heard of it? No? Yes? No? Son? Yes? Oh, wow. Okay. All right. We did okay. All right, that gets us fully into postmodernism now. And we're going to take a little detour in the Critique Week reading from Adorno, although he'll be writing in the late 60s, and he'll be looking at the same set of circumstances that Crimp and Krauss are trying to address, but from a different vantage point, from a different perspective. All right, enjoy the week of vacation. This is the first time we're getting a full week for Thanksgiving, by the way. So I'm actually traveling, which I've never been able to do before because usually it was just a long weekend. It was like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So enjoy the time off. I'll see you guys, like I said, Critique Week. I'll send a reminder that we'll be meeting then. And if you can't make it, then I'll see you in the final week.